Welcome to the 435th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today, I welcome long COVID patient and advocate Charlie McCone. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID calls live. Just go to the COVID calls YouTube channel to watch, and you can also watch it live on Twitter. You can hear COVID calls anytime recorded as podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID calls. Please do help spread the word. And as always, please feel free to send suggestions or suggest yourself as a future guest. Just a reminder, we are aiming to the 2-year mark on March 16th for COVID calls. And at that point, we will have done 500 episodes of COVID calls. I'm still looking for guests leading up to that point. And so if you have research related to COVID, if you have art related to COVID, or you know somebody whose voice you think should be part of this archive of our time, please do get in touch with me by email or on Twitter. Direct message is fine. As of February 25th, 2022, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center, the United States reports 946,823 deaths from COVID. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is "Another Casualty of Russia's Invasion, Ukraine's Ability to Contain the Coronavirus." This appeared February 24th, 2022 in the New York Times by Adil Hassan. While Ukraine is under attack by Russia, Ukraine's civilian population is also under siege from the coronavirus, a situation only likely to worsen. The fighting in Ukraine's east is forcing a mass migration to the west that is crowding mass transit centers and trains and jamming roads. Video images of the large numbers of Ukrainians on the move show understandably few signs of face coverings, even as the country is just getting past a record high point in its infection rate. The coronavirus outlook for those fleeing the fighting is grim, according to Dr. Eric S. Toner, a senior scholar at the Center for Health Security at the Bloomberg School of Public Health of Johns Hopkins University. They're quite vulnerable. And as people huddle together, either sheltering or evacuating in crowded buses, trains, and cars, maybe in hotels and refugee camps, it's going to cause a reversal of the progress, he said in an interview on Thursday. They can't maintain distance and they don't have access to masks. Many people are heading to smaller towns or villages or crossing the border into Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. And the flow of refugees will likely affect those countries' pandemic situations too. Senior Biden administration officials say that between 1 million and 5 million people in Ukraine could seek safety in some other part of the country or in neighboring countries. On Thursday, the United Nations High Commission for Refugees said that it was already increasing its operations in Ukraine and neighboring countries. Dr. Toner said that he expected Ukraine's neighbors to see a rise in their COVID case numbers and additional stress on their healthcare systems from refugees, but those problems will be worse inside Ukraine. They're going to be caring for COVID patients along with war victims, he said. They're going to be understaffed because of the war, and it's going to harm their chances of keeping patients in isolation or have social distancing. It's going to be a mess. Ukraine is reporting an average of about 26,000 new cases a day, or 63 cases per 100,000 people, according to the Our World in Data project at the University of Oxford. Only about 1/3 of Ukraine's 44 million people are fully inoculated against the coronavirus, though Ukrainian officials said this month that the army had a 99% vaccination rate. Russia, despite being one of the first countries to develop and approve a coronavirus vaccine, has fully vaccinated only half of its population, according to Our World in Data. It is also dealing with an Omicron surge, recording an average of 160,000 new cases over the last 7 days. That's 111 cases per 100,000 people. Ukraine does not recognize Russia's Sputnik 5 vaccine, while Russia does not recognize the Western manufactured vaccines administered in Ukraine. The Russian invasion is also likely to hurt Ukraine's ability to track the virus, Dr. Toner said. If the country's data becomes unreliable, that would be a particularly important loss for epidemiologists because the country is in the heart of Eastern Europe. I would suspect that we're going to stop getting a lot of data from Ukraine, Dr. Toner said. The hospitals and local health departments are not going to have that as a priority. Okay, I'd like to turn to the conversation for today, and I'm very happy to welcome my guest, Charlie McCone. Let me introduce you to him. Charlie McCone is a 32-year-old long COVID patient and advocate based in San Francisco who was struck with a quote-unquote mild case of the virus in March 2020 and has suffered severe, debilitating symptoms ongoing for 2 years now. Prior to illness, he was in the prime of his life with no health issues to speak of. He was an active tennis player, cyclist, and musician who biked 10 miles a day and ran 10 miles a week and worked full-time as a nonprofit professional. He's currently on short-term disability, is severely housebound, and relies on his long-term partner as a full-time caretaker. And like many long COVID patients, he has seen over 50 doctors and healthcare providers since his illness. Many of his long COVID symptoms remain unexplained and untreated. Charlie McCone, thank you for making time to join me on COVID Calls today.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for having me, and thanks for taking the time to shine a light on this, what is really an overlooked issue of this pandemic.
I'd like to start the way I usually do, find out where you're calling from and what the pandemic situation looks like there.
Yeah, I'm actually calling from Napa, California, currently usually based in San Francisco, but up here just for a little bit to be a little bit closer to friends and family. And in terms of the pandemic situation, it seems like cases are going down. It seems like people are eager to kind of get back to, less restrictions and things of that nature. But it still seems kind of like everybody's holding their breath on what the BA2 variant is going to look like and what's going to be, the effects of these, of lessening the restrictions.
So I've been asking guests to share a personal memory of this COVID time, and we're going to talk about your COVID case in March of 2020. But there may be other memories that you want to talk about as well. So let me open that up to you. What do you associate in terms of when you think about this last 2 years? What are your strongest associations?
I mean, I turned 30 in January 2020, and I got sick March of that year, and I've been sick ever since. So I've been dealing with long COVID, been severely disabled for my entire 30s. And it feels like, I've fell into the rabbit hole in Alice in Wonderland or stuck in the Twilight Zone. And I'm still kind of, it's becoming a crowded place as well. And we're all in here trying to kind of figure out how to get out. And of course, that's what I associate, the most with this pandemic. It's been, I feel, bizarre for everybody, difficult for everybody. But in terms of our, physical, lived experience, it's definitely been an out-of-body experience this entire time.
You described your COVID case as a quote-unquote mild case.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience of COVID, particularly it was early in the pandemic?
Yeah. So, I mean, I got sick, or I first had symptoms on the first day of lockdown, which was very eerie. I remember I was running to the beach and back, which was my kind of bi-weekly 3-mile run. And I was running back and I was like, whoa, there's people lining up outside the grocery store. This is really happening. I guess this is the lockdown happening. And I got back that night, and then I started noticing a pressure in my chest for the first time really in my life. I was like, that's odd. And then the next day I just started to feel, really achy, kind of general malaise. And then by the end of that day, for the first time in my life, I was short of breath. And I was like, oh no. And I called the doctor, and they say, yeah, it sounds like you have a viral respiratory infection. We're going to presume it's COVID, but we can't test you right now because we're only testing people who are severe cases or have known contact, et cetera. let's, just hang tight. By the end of that weekend, I was completely bedbound. I couldn't get out of bed, and I was severely short of breath. And I was like that for the next week or so. For 2 weeks, severely short of breath, bedbound. We called the ER multiple times, and they said, "Look, you can talk. We can't see you." I think in the spectrum of mild to severe, that was probably more moderate. It was not mild. Right now, if you're short of breath, they're not considering that a mild case, but it's still, quote unquote, a mild case. I wasn't hospitalized, didn't need to be hospitalized. Did I suffer from a lack of treatment early on? Not clear. And by the third week, started to feel like I was kind of getting better. And then by the end of the fourth week, I was like, hey, I think I'm getting over this. I had very little symptoms. So I went and got on my bike, tried to go grab some tacos, got back, and all of a sudden, boom, it was the first wave of the first relapse that was the first time I exerted myself. And all the symptoms came back with a vengeance, and was completely out for the next week. And that cycle was the beginning of my long COVID journey, and it has resembled that nature ever since. And then at the 2-month mark, I, kind of pulling out my hair, like, do I have some weird disease? Do I have cancer? What's going on? And then I, kind of jumped online and found this group, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of posts of other people saying, hey, I'm still sick. I have no health issues. What's going on? I was like, oh my God, there's this thing. And then by the second mark, I started developing new weird symptoms. This is 2 months after the infection. I started having full body muscle twitching in my leg, on my back. When you get like an eye twitch from too much caffeine, or sometimes it was like that, but happening everywhere in my body. Never happened before. And that has never gone away, but it's something that came. And then at the 3rd month mark, I noticed one day I was walking into the kitchen again, feel like I'm getting better. I noticed my heart rate was 150. And by the end of that day, I had severe left chest pain. And after, going to the doctor's bag, like, something's weird. And they thought I had myocarditis develop at that point. It was eventually the diagnosis was reversed, but it was kind of initial signs of that. And I was diagnosed with what is now a common complication with long COVID patients, which is POTS, which is a form of, it's an autonomic dysfunction categorized as a form of dysautonomia, where basically whenever you stand up, your heart rate it's a circulation disorder where your heart rate jumps up to 100, 150. You hear that a lot with long COVID patients of the autonomic nervous system, circulatory system just being completely out of whack. So all of that to say is that it has been this barrage of waxing and waning symptoms that have been relentless. And I, tried to work through them, the first year and a half. And by the last summer, I ended up just collapsing. I couldn't do it anymore. And that's my biggest regret, is just trying to push through my symptoms, not understanding kind of the nature of the disease at that point, or the nature of post-viral diseases at that point as well. And eventually, after my second attempt, got on short-term disability with a new doctor last year. And we've been, trying to get a management plan in place. I was unfortunately reinfected last September, which led to pneumonia and a big deterioration of case. And this is another unfortunate, common story, is that patients are finally they're not recovering, but maybe they're getting to 70%.
Right.
And then they get hit again with the virus. I was vaccinated, many people are vaccinated, and they're kind of starting at the bottom of the ditch, or the bottom of the hill again, and trying to work their way back up. So that is kind of, I guess, the short version of the story. And it's been, again, I'm at this point just completely debilitated. For this meeting alone, I had to kind of plan it as the main thing I did today. I had to plan it as one of the main 3 things I was going to do this week. I have to rest for multiple hours leading up to anything to this. I have to rest for multiple hours after something like this. And so it can be hard looking at somebody like me talking look like I probably haven't shaved in a while at least, but looking like he looks okay. It's really, it's hard to really digest the severity of the illness that people with this condition are going through. And we've been trying, I think, hard for the past 2 years as a patient community to warn the public, like, look, this is a disaster. At the rates at which this is happening, this is going to be the biggest mass disabling event in history. And we're still just completely perplexed why there isn't a public health warning. Why aren't we tracking these cases? And the research is not anywhere near proportionate to which this is happening. And from our perspective, it's like, look, the more cases, the better off we're probably going to be, because that's going to eventually lead to some sort of treatment, but it's still just traumatizing. We're seeing the biggest influx of long COVID patients from the Omicron wave in our patient communities now.
Right.
People are saying, hey, I got sick. What's this long COVID thing? I didn't know anything about this. I'm still sick 8 weeks later. And for the first time, I now have somebody in every single one of my personal network social groups who knows somebody who's dealing with it. And so where before I knew only one of two people in my personal network. And I feel like that kind of was why people didn't take it as seriously, because they were, well, if it was so common, we would hear more about it. Where now people are hearing about it, and it's scary because with everything I've gone through, I have finally found a great team of doctors who understand everything up to the cutting edge research. Still having a really difficult time understanding what to do. So many people in the healthcare system are just at a loss of how to manage this right now.
Well, thank you for going through that and explaining the various different details of it. And I'm really sorry for what you've gone through. I mean,
Thank you.
I just want to say that. I mean, and I've talked with lots of long COVID patients on COVID calls, and every story is a little different.
Yeah.
But one of the things in common is the anxiety that sort of rises to the surface as the different waves you described as sort of a series of, progress and setback and progress and setback. And so I wanted to talk with you a little bit about that too, because it's not just the anxiety of being sick, it's the anxiety of anticipation of being sick, and then also not having medical lack of understanding there, and then lack of society, as you point out. You open the news, it's everything COVID, but nothing long COVID in that first year. How have you managed the anxiety of all of this, Charlie?
I mean, that's a good point. And I think any long COVID patient may tell you that the one of the hardest, if not the hardest thing about the disease is having, say, a couple good days, maybe a couple good weeks, and then the relapse. And you're just like, no, I really thought this might be me turning some type of corner. And I think that part of it mentally is just the most devastating part, is that you feel like you're figuring out this. You feel like this is a Rolodex. You feel like you have a good system now in place, but you never really trust the ground under your feet. And some people are getting better too. So it's not like it's completely hopeless. You're stuck in this, like, well, some people are getting better. They tried this, there's got to be a way out for me here. So we are all still stuck in this, like, there's a solution, but how far and how hard is it going to be still feels very elusive. And so all of us are still, trying to fight our way out. And so when we have that relapse, it's really difficult. I'd say after the first year is just pure, emergency. It's just like, what's going on? You feel like every month, is around the corner. You should get better. So it's just everything's an emergency. The second year, and this is how other post-viral patients have explained it too, is just kind of just abject misery. You're just like, this has been a year. I'm not getting better. This is really devastating. After that, you think, you're kind of like, okay, I'm here. This is devastating. But you kind of compartmentalize that at that point. It's like, okay, this is not the quality of life, that I'm willing to accept for myself. But I have to kind of compartmentalize that. Kicking and screaming isn't helping anymore. What do I need to do to both make my days, more bearable and manageable? And what do I need to do to kind of keep my eye on the ball and feeling optimistic about like, what am I doing to put one foot in front of the other to try the next thing? And so I think at a certain point, you just I've been just trying to orientate my days around what can I do to minimize my symptoms and maximize my joy despite this, um, you know, incredibly difficult experience, and to kind of minimize the mental stress, which is only exacerbates symptoms. And so it's a little bit of a Chinese finger trap, or like you're in quicksand. Is like the harder you push, the harder you kick and scream, the faster you sink. And you kind of learn that after 2 years. But that's kind of my long-winded stay of it. Still remains incredibly difficult, incredibly devastating for me, my friends, family. Losing kind of not being able to read when I want to, not want to listen to music I want to, not be able to eat the foods I want to, not be able to have coffee, not be able to have this. It all sucks. But at a certain point, you mentally adapt to like, what do I need to do to just have my days to be more bearable? And also, what do I need to do to get a plan in place that makes me kind of stay in the fight?
So I just want to remind everyone that you're listening to COVID Calls. Today I'm talking with long COVID patient Charlie McCone about his experience of living with long COVID. And Charlie, you have also, of the energy that you have, you've apportioned part of that to public outreach, which I think is I'm really impressed that you've made time to do that. And the San Francisco Chronicle profiled you, and there was a statement in there which really stuck out to me. I'm just going to read it. In the piece, you said, "I don't think the public is well informed around this possible outcome from COVID. And I think if they were, younger folks might exercise more caution and prudence. This is just not being well articulated enough." And I wanted to follow up with you on that a little bit because, there's an unfortunate series of unfortunate discourses around COVID from the beginning that have sought to minimize it.
Sure.
Minimize it for young children, minimize the Omicron variant. At various moments, there seem to always be people there saying it's not so bad. And I thought I was really, moved by that statement of yours, because it particularly, I think, for people who are, in their 20s, 30s, 40s, healthy, this has generally been treated as something that you will have and get over, and then you move on with your life. And you have a different story to tell.
Yeah, I have a very different story to tell. And again, if this was just me and one or two other people, then I think I'd be like, yeah, I got unlucky, some weird thing happening. But now we know how often this is happening. We know how severely disabling this is happening. There's now an 81 study meta-analysis showing that it's 10 to 30% of people are becoming this sick. And we know that over half of them definitely are still sick after a year. And, there's a variety of estimates. The Mayo Clinic said, we're seeing estimates from 10 to 50%. And we're not sure what the exact number is. What we know for sure is that this condition is not rare, right? And so that is the alarming part of it. So part of, I think the patient community and myself, the reason we are trying to talk about this is, one, just a sense of urgency. That's like, why isn't the CDC, why aren't folks being adequately warned about the risk of infection? It could be described as misinformation. That I would say isn't that much different than the misinformation that anti-vaxxers are trying to prescribe about the risk of vaccination. We are not giving people the total information about the risk of infection, and it is an alarming number. It is not rare. Rare is something that happens in medical terms, 1 in 10,000 or 1,000 people. This is happening in the most conservative estimates. People are debilitated for at least 3 months to 1 in 10 folks. And we have yet to see studies that have proved otherwise. There is some encouraging information about the vaccine reducing that number by half, but then we're looking at 5 to 15% instead of 10 to 30%. Still not rare, still very common. And so one of the biggest gripes and failures, I think, is, one, we're not warning the public still. And this is very clear by all the folks who just got sick with Omicron. And we now know that there's more deaths now from Omicron than Delta. So speaking, we're going to see more morbidity in Omicron as well. So and all of these folks are saying, I didn't know this could happen. I was vaccinated. I was boosted. What's going on? And that's a failure of public health, who knew how severe this is, how common it is, and still not warning the public. Now, why that is, everybody can speculate, but it'd be very hard, I think, for public health agencies to say this is a mild variant. Hospitalizations are decreasing. We can open things up again, while simultaneously saying, but 1 in 10 of every people who get sick are going to be indefinitely disabled. And so I think that's the clear dilemma, right? Is what costs, are we going to just accept as a society? And it seems like long COVID is that cost that we're willing to accept right now, which is terrifying to me. And I do think that there was a study from Forbes that showed folks who were well informed on long COVID were more likely to get vaccinated. And then the folks who were unvaccinated, once they learned about long COVID, 40% of them were then more willing to consider the vaccination. So there's studies saying that, yes, if you inform people about the risk, they're going to take that risk into consideration. And everybody may not believe it. Everybody may not think that's going to happen to them. And, we know there's a lot of internalized, ableism and things like that. But there's going to be people who do respond say, hey, I know somebody, I know Charlie, and I don't want that to happen to me. So yes, if this is happening this often, we need to know about it.
It occurs to me that, if you look at the way that public health information is distributed around smoking or around, high-fat diet, we really, in the last decade, certainly in my lifetime, the idea that you could talk in meaningful and effective ways to people about chronic disease, it's out there. It's public health researchers and communicators know what they're doing. But the political winds here have been blowing so strong to get over it, get past it, or just outright deny it in the Trump administration, but even in the Biden administration, to get to some point in which they can say, well, this is behind us now, that it has not left space for the kind of communication that you're calling for.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's also on, the medical community does not have a great track record with post-viral illness in general, right? We know that there are other post-viral conditions. We know pandemics disable people. We know there was, people didn't want to get polio because they want to get post-polio syndrome. We know after the influenza, there was, the weird neurological situations that happened. We know, of course, about myalgic encephalitis and dysautonomia, chronic Lyme. The medical community doesn't have a good track record of both studying these conditions, treating these conditions, or taking them seriously. Now, let's say in an alternate universe, those things were well taken seriously. Maybe long COVID would be easier for the medical community to digest, to swallow, and incorporate into public health messaging. And if they had a solution too, right, I think it'd be easier for people to digest. The fact is, it's the sheer number of folks who are coming down with this is just confronting a major blind spot in medicine that nobody was prepared for and is ready for. And it may take now, unfortunately, at the rate things are going, years until they have a solution for it. And so it does seem like people aren't going to be eager to talk about this until there's a solution to it. However, I think now you're seeing in the past few months, this has been at the front page of the Washington Post. This has been on the front page of the New York Times. And I think it's because their staff are now getting disabled and they're writing these stories. This from Rolling Stone, where the first 2 years it was still treated with skepticism and it was page 7 and et cetera and so forth. But now I'm like, who wrote this article? And I'm like, oh, it was from a long COVID patient. No wonder it was so good. And so now these media institutions are saying, yeah, we got to figure this out here because, some of our best, most productive employees are not getting back to work. They've been sick for a year. And so I think in the past 6 months, we're seeing the snowball start to roll a little bit faster, gain a little bit more momentum, but still not anywhere near the pace in which it needs to deal with the problem at hand. There, for instance, last summer, they found what I still and a lot of folks believe is the most promising biomarker to date for long COVID, and they found in South Africa over 70 out of 70 patients they studied had amyloid microclots in their blood detected in that would otherwise other coagulation and blood markers were completely normal, and they responded all to anticoagulant therapy. And so I'm like, okay, great. Maybe by the end of the year, there's going to be a treatment here. That study has still yet to be replicated. Why? I can understand we don't have a solution. We're struggling with public health messaging, but why isn't the medical community and saying, let's replicate that? That's an easy thing to find. It's an easy thing to treat. Why is that still taking so long? That I think is one of the most frustrating parts for long COVID patients right now, is that there's hundreds of papers that are describing this is a clear, there's great consensus that this is a vascular phenomenon, and there are 1 to 2 to 3 to maybe 4 culprits driving it that we need to get to the bottom of. However, there's more than enough information right now to start moving the ball on small clinical trials, on replicating research, and none of that is happening. It's these long, multi-year observational studies from big 3-letter health institutions. And that is business as usual. This isn't business as usual. This is a mass disabling event where 10 to 30% of folks are coming down with this condition. And so that's where I'm just truly confused. Like, I can understand it, there being political reasons of not being adequately warned, which is deeply unethical, and I think in a lot of people's minds. But why isn't the medical community trying to catch up to speed to make it more politically palatable? Because I've seen 55 doctors. I don't want to know how much that has costed, the healthcare, industry, the insurance industry. It's cost me a lot of money. And that's the story for a lot of folks. This is not cost efficient. It just doesn't make any sense from any perspective, an economic perspective, a moral perspective, a social perspective. So that's where I'm like genuinely confused. Are they just not, are there some people not aware, who are in these important power position? But then again, Dr. Fauci has acknowledged it. He says this, he knows how serious this is. So again, that's where there is, I think, there's a disconnect somewhere. And it's not exactly clear to me why. I'm not super still familiar with the intricacies of the pharmaceutical, clinical trial, public health complex, and all of that. I do know that one of the biggest gripes is, to take something from clinical to bedside is usually 17 years. I know that's not going to work for this. So that's where I think a lot of people feel frustrated right now, is there's so much promising information about what's going on with this disease. Why aren't we building off of that and trying to replicate that as fast as possible?
Well, it's also to hear, you describe that number from clinical to bedside in 17 years. But of course, we've just lived through a time in which an mRNA vaccine by multiple companies was developed in a year for a new disease.
And they had the technology within a few months.
So, when the urgency is there, the biomedical capacity is immense, it's staggering. I wanted to ask you about another, let me just remind folks you're listening to COVID Calls. I'm talking to Charlie McCone today about long COVID. I wanted to follow up another part of this, Charlie, which has to do with sort of your education through this as a patient advocate and as a member of a community. And I've talked with, for example, Dr. Marjorie Roberts, who's a long COVID patient and advocate. And, to hear her talk about how you build a community sort of person by person through this is really impressive, but also, frankly, sounds pretty exhausting.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks would say it at least from the patient community side, it's been one of the few, I'd say, solaces though, is knowing other people who are going through this, knowing you're not alone. People have very similar stories to you, knowing some people are getting better. And with maybe the right luck and treatment and time, you will too. I'd say being able to connect with folks is what keeps a lot of people going. And if they were completely alone, and there wasn't, the internet for this, I would be very concerned about the rates of self harm, expediting, which within the community is unfortunately, happening and beginning to happen more, and we're very concerned about that. But being able to connect with each other has been a huge sanity relief. People really struggle with understanding what you're going through. My girlfriend does, my mom does, my dad does. They believe me, my work does. They believe me, but they still struggle with, like, how are you feeling good this morning but not now? Why are you feeling good tonight, but a few hours ago before dinner you weren't? And so it's really difficult to understand, and being able to share that experience with other people and it be, so uncannily similar has been like, okay, there's power in numbers here at some point, and it keeps us all, I think, mentally in the fight. Otherwise, I think the hopelessness, despair would be greater. In terms of the advocacy part of it and building it patient by patient, I'm not involved with a specific group like Body Politic or Survivor. Of course, I'm now friends with all of these folks, and I think the fact that this has been a patient-led condition and disease has been really very powerful in both helping folks become aware of this. And I think with any advocacy, realm, there's going to be a few, moments of tension or bumps in the road of people having different ideas of priorities or different strategies about how to accomplish those priorities. Those have felt very minimal to me. And it seems like what's so surprising to me is, for instance, in other diseases, there's a spectrum, such a wide spectrum of what people believe the priorities are, what they think the disease is, what they think the condition is. I am so surprised around how unified the long COVID community is in terms of what our demands are and what we believe, is the underlying, disease process. It's not a huge spectrum of beliefs at this point. And that to me is so, it's like we're a giant ant organism where everybody's just in line and there's not a lot of argument there. I mean, there is small things, but everybody more or less is believing the same things, seeing the same things, and understanding what the priorities are. We need a public health warning. We need to track these cases, and we need treatment, and we need support for these folks. A lot of people aren't qualifying for disability. If you can't work in disability, what's going to happen? You need financial support. Nobody disagrees with any of that. And I think everybody more or less agrees with those, 4 tenets in terms of the disease process. We know this is immune dysregulation. This is very likely microvascular phenomena, which cannot be measured with regular testing. Yale just came out and said, you can't measure this without invasive testing. This invasive testing is not common. And so everybody is more or less finding the same things, coming to the same consensus. And so I'm quite personally, from my perspective, amazed on the harmony within the community. I think some people who are maybe a little bit more in the weeds of the advocacy world would maybe have a slightly different perspective. But for someone who's a very active vocal patient, I don't see a lot of the tension that maybe other folks and other, because long COVID patients are stepping into the world of both the disability community as well as the post-viral community, which are very well established communities. And they have been fantastic allies, and there has been great knowledge shared from both medical history, advocacy history that have really helped, I think, this moment. And I'm surprised with the amount of harmony and how everybody, to me at least personally, feels like we're more or less on the same page, plus minus here and there,
I just want to, underline the points that you made there. So what you're calling for, and the community, long COVID community broadly, calling for public health warning, tracking, research, and assistance. And I wanted to pick up the last piece of that, because throughout the pandemic, there has been, and not enough by my counting, but still, direct public assistance for people early in the pandemic who were facing, job loss, or their And then there's been assistance for people with their student loans. I mean, there've been a number of ways that the government has responded financially. Again, I don't think it's been enough. But this seems to be a hard one. This problem of getting disability. Can you say a little bit more about that? And is this sort of also kind of a state by state thing? So if you're in California or Massachusetts, maybe you might do a little bit better with this than other states, or is this really a federal government issue?
I think that is a good question. I know, for instance, if you're in California, you're going to have a much easier time than if you're in Texas, right? And right now, today there was a devastating. I just shared an article in the Rolling Stone Times of just detailing folks who are now homeless, who were teachers, who were bartenders, who have long COVID because they weren't able to get disability. And from my understanding, there's barriers to short-term disability, and then there are massive barriers to long-term disability. And it took me, somebody who was at a very supportive employer, great health insurance, great team of doctors, and I'd say was fairly neurologically, at least the first year, highly functioning. The first year, I had just devastating cardiorespiratory symptoms, but my neurological symptoms were fairly intact, which was, not the case for most patients. It took me a year and a half to get short-term disability under those circumstances in California, the most generous state for short-term disability. And there is no federal program, to the best of my knowledge, for this. And it is acknowledged under the ADA right now, but it's all case by case. And it's just a disaster. I mean, the short-term the disability system is set up for people with visible disability,
right?
Something you can easily measure. And we know with other folks who have had similar conditions with post-viral situations, it takes them years to get on long-term disability if they ever get on it. And that is harrowing for somebody. My short-term disability is going to run out in the coming months. And I have to figure out, what do I do? Am I going to be well enough to go back a little bit to work, or do I have to hire a lawyer and start figuring out how to do long-term disability? That's one of my biggest stressors right now, is trying to figure that out. And at the rate of my current recovery, I'm not optimistic. And so assistance is a massive issue. And arguably maybe the most immediate issue and need issue, right along with research and treatment. And so I can't imagine what it would be like if I, was a gig worker working in Texas,
right,
with severe neurological symptoms, where I can't for me, on the more moderate side of neurological symptoms, reading instructions is the hardest thing. You get me in front of a camera and I can kind of talk okay for a little bit, as long as, my lungs can handle. But trying to write an email or read something new is so hard. So I can't imagine what it's like for people with severe brain fog, with severe cognitive deficits, trying to navigate this already incredibly complex system that's not meant for them. And so we are seeing what's happening. People are becoming homeless. They're losing their houses. They're going through their savings. Their relationships are being ruined because of this. They're losing their careers, their jobs. It's tragic. Just just outside of the physical experience of it, having to go through all of this with, again, no clear outlook on when it's going to change and when there's going to be light at the end of the tunnel for any relief.
Are you feeling okay? Can we go one more question, or are we ready to?
Yeah, I got probably another good 5-10 minutes.
Okay, so something you said a moment ago, really struck me, and about the people in your life who love you and believe you, but still there's this challenge, and I think this is true in chronic disease generally.
Yeah.
I think back, as a child, my grandmother had a autoimmune disease, and so she was a very active person. She was an artist, brilliant cook, just one of the best people I've ever known in my life. But she had to sit down and rest, and she didn't talk about it much. But I just never understood it, and I was a kid, so I had no framework of understanding how to like offer sympathy. But it's like what you were just describing. I think if it was something visible, so it's not that I didn't believe her, but I just had no way to connect to it because it was like, oh, she's tired again. Well, older people get tired, but there was a gulf of understanding there, and it makes me think about an article that Virginia Heffernan wrote not long ago in Wired magazine, and the headline I think was, "Why is it so hard to believe other people's pain?" And I guess it's a question I have for you based on your experience now, because I think you have a really unique vantage point on this, but it kind of speaks to the human condition in 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 ways that bother me, but I think we need to talk about, which is how can I support you? How can we learn to trust?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and it's something I've thought about multiple times throughout this process. Is there is an empathy deficit? I think there's a lot of sympathy, but there's a real empathy deficit of just truly understanding. When you're somebody who is, most people in their life have never really been sick for longer than 2 to 3 days, maybe a week, and it's just like in your DNA, to like, well, you get sick, you're just going to get better. So I think unless you're somebody who's been struck with an unfortunate illness, maybe something like cancer, or even a prolonged, injury, back injury, or something like that. It's just innately so difficult to comprehend the concept of getting sick and not getting better. And I think it's something that's so confusing that people, at the sixth, I think one of the hardest parts of this illness is being sick at between the 2 month mark and like the 4 month mark, because you're just going insane. You're like, this isn't how things work. What's going on? This doesn't make any sense. Nothing computes. And I think it's because it's so counterintuitive to the human experience to not bounce back. It's so counterintuitive to the narratives we hear in our lives, our whole life. It's so counterintuitive to what is, I've come to understand, a very ableist society, where the way our world is shaped is, once you can get knocked down, you get up again. But to get knocked down and stay down, that doesn't make sense. You're just not, trying hard enough is our instinct. And we have to curb that instinct if we become self-aware and we become sympathetic. But it still, I think, becomes incredibly difficult to empathize until you really experience it. And so I don't know that I have a great answer to your question, other than I think the more people tell their stories, the more people listen to them, the more people might be, understanding. I don't know what it's like to go through ALS. I don't know what it's like to go through cancer therapy. I don't know what it's like to have MS. But when people share their stories, I think to myself, oh my God, I don't want that. And I think the more long COVID patients tell their stories, hopefully we can start to build a more collective, we can start to close that empathy deficit as a society. However, I think the nature of this condition and the nature of this pandemic, where people's personal experiences have been so, I think that's been part of the problem with the pandemic, is people's personal experiences have been so ranged, where my grandma got it, she's fine. But yeah, someone's random uncle got it, and now he's dead. And my friend who used to run 20 miles a week is still sick 2 years later.
Right.
And so it's such the brutal randomness of it has made it even more difficult for folks to both digest what's going on and to trust, folks, what's going on. Are you sure this person just wasn't suffering from severe anxiety and just isn't coping with the pandemic very well? I understand that. I think that is like, this doesn't make sense. And what's going on with this guy? Thankfully now we have unequivocal, clear biomarkers. Long COVID patients aren't extracting, they're only extracting 50% of their blood oxygen into their vital organs, where regular people are extracting 75%. Clearly, there's something very wrong. I don't know that many long COVID patients feel that insecure about that part of it as they maybe did the first year or 3 months. But I still feel like the nature of post-viral diseases, the nature of this pandemic is made the empathy deficit greater in under a environment where our worst instincts have been, I think, expressed, and our empathy deficit is even close to folks dying. We know there's 3,000 people still dying every day, and we've become numb to that. And so I think all I can really say is that's part of why I share my story. I mean, people have said, "Oh, you're so brave, you're so for sharing your story." I'm like, I don't think of it like that. I think of it as, one, I want to get better. And so I'm doing it for selfish reasons. And I feel like if I share my story, it may draw some more urgency to the attention, might lead to more treatment so I can get out of this twilight zone. But also it's just like, how are people not knowing about this? There's no way we can let people experience what I'm experiencing. So there is just an instinctual sense of urgency. We have to warn people about this hurricane that people are experiencing, because this is just crazy. And I think as more people are sharing their experience, people are beginning to digest it. But a lot of folks in the disability community, in the post-viral community, are skeptical that people have the capability to fully understand and overcome their ableist instincts. My perspective is that we have ableist instincts, but we also have instincts of fear and self-preservation. And I think if enough people hear about this, those instincts are going to kick in too, and they're going to take it more seriously. And so if I had a perfect answer to your question, maybe we wouldn't be in the situation we are in. But it is something I think about. It is something my family struggles with. It is something my friends, I think, struggle with, especially when they call me and I sound okay for 5 minutes. They're like, sound like he's doing good. And they don't see me laying on the couch for the other 18 hours of the day. It's the nature of chronic illness is difficult to really understand. And I could go on and on about this, but you struck a nerve there clearly. And that's why I encourage folks who are going through this to continue sharing their story. The last thing I will say, just because it triggered it, is a lot of people have said, like, if this was as common as it is, I feel like I would just know more people with this. And I got something I totally get too. What I don't think people understand is most people are not like me. They don't want the world to know every medical problem with them. They don't want to know. They respect their privacy. I had a friend reach out recently. He's like, I'm shocked to tell you this, but I just found out my uncle has been dealing with long COVID for a year and he wants to connect with you. I had no idea. I've seen him a few times and I've talked to him multiple times, and he didn't tell me until he read your story. And there is so much of that happening, where there are people in people's lives who are experiencing long COVID, but they're keeping it to themselves because they don't want either their employer to know, or they don't know how their friends and family are going to react, or they just don't feel comfortable sharing that part of their medical issue. We know people on a general basis underreport their symptoms. They don't over-report their symptoms. Everybody knows the story of their uncle or their dad who they have to finally drag into the emergency room, or finally drag into the routine. So why would we expect this to be that much different? And why would we expect people to be over-reporting symptoms? That's what I truly don't understand. And one of the main qualms I take with people who are critical about survey information, which has been a different point of topic about how common this is, yada, yada, yada. So again, I do encourage folks to share their story. So hopefully we can bridge the understanding.
I just want to remind everyone you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can usually catch COVID Calls live at 7 p.m. Eastern Time weekdays, although these days we're doing COVID Calls kind of round the clock as we head up to the 2-year anniversary of the COVID Calls project, March 16th. I want to thank my guest, Charlie McCone, for a really powerful hour. I learned a lot from you. And I think your call for concrete action from the medical community and from government and from people just to close that empathy deficit, as you said. It's a powerful one. And I hope you're not on the couch for 18 hours after this discussion, but it was a really powerful one. And I think it's going to help people. Thank you, Charlie, for coming on today.
Thank you, Scott. Again, I appreciate it. And I do think the more people like yourself draw attention to this within the conversation of COVID and the pandemic, the more we are going to create more urgency. And at a certain point, there's just going to be a tipping point, and we're going to have to figure this out. And it may not help everybody at that point, but it can help a lot of people, and it can improve the quality of life for a lot of people, I believe, at some point. The question to me now is this going to be in a year, 5 years, or 10 years? And we want that time frame to be as short as possible. And unfortunately, at the rate things are going, so many people are getting sick that I do feel like this twilight zone is starting to become, as I said before, such a crowded place that it's becoming difficult to ignore.
Stay healthy, everyone, and we will see you next time on COVID Calls. And thank you, Charlie.
Thank you.